Welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Aaron Porras, and coming up in today's newscast, clashes in Ashdod as Israelis fight against coronavirus closures. Meanwhile, free speech under attack again in the wake of banning President Trump from social media. And the internet asked, Israeli pilots answered. Stay tuned for a very special message from the Israeli Air Force. We open tonight with breaking news in announcing the passing of Jewish-American businessman and philanthropist Sheldon Adelson. Mr. Adelson was 87 years old, and we send our condolences to his loved ones. And as it's said in Hebrew, Zichrono Livracha, may his memory be a blessing. Now, moving on, yet another record set by Israel, and unfortunately not in the good way. Coronavirus infections continuing to trend upwards in spite of officials' best efforts to vaccinate and cure the public. Nearly 10,000 new coronavirus cases recorded overnight for a positivity rate of 7.6%, now bringing the total number of infections in Israel to over 500,000 people, the active number of cases now around 74,000, and the death toll rising by 19 over Monday to 3,723. Yet in spite of the dangerously trending numbers and full lockdown measures, there are many continuing to ignore the horrific writing on the wall. For one, ultra-Orthodox Jews of the B'nai Torah movement clashing with police over the closure of illegally reopened yeshivas and synagogues in their community, including injuring officers with sticks, bottles, and stones, blocking roads and rioting.
אנחנו מודיעים למשטרה בהודעה ברורה, תסלקו את הידיים שלכם מבתי הכנסיות, תסלקו את הידיים שלכם ממקומות התורה שלנו. אוי ואבוי לכם אם תיגעו בהם. מה שאתם רואים פה זה רק דגימון, אפילו לא פרומו, למה שעומד להיות, אם אתם תיגעו במוסדות התורה.
And this after yeshivas and synagogues in the Mea Shearim neighborhood of Jerusalem similarly reopened on Sunday against lockdown restrictions. Meanwhile, Israel's senior Sephardic rabbi, Yitzchak Yosef, who is paid a public salary, is also now under investigation after hosting and attending numerous mass gatherings over the course of the last few months and even days, completely ignoring social distancing and mask-wearing regulations. Then, not to be outdone, thousands of fines and arrests over secular rule breakers are also reported in the last few days for crowding onto the beaches and even breaking self-isolation orders. Still, Israel is working overtime to inoculate the public, health authorities setting the goal of having 5.2 million Israelis vaccinated by the end of March. And as part of this goal, upwards of 1.3 million Israelis are slated to receive their first vaccine dose by the end of the month, including active duty soldiers for whom the first shipment of Moderna's vaccine is now allocated. And this alongside the 1.8 million others who are getting their second dose of the Pfizer vaccine this month as well. Of course, staying on top of the world for vaccinations has its own costs, with Israel paying upwards of $47 per person for the vaccines, about $10 to $20 per person more expensive than what the US and EU is paying for their respective shipments. Then finally, as for the Palestinians, Ramallah has now finally approved of the Russian Sputnik vaccine for use in the territories. First shipments expected to arrive soon.
تعاقدت وزارة الصحة مع 4 شركات لتوريد اللقاح ستصل بالتوالي خلال الشهرين القادمين، وستبدأ العملية بالطواقم الصحية ثم المرضى وكبار السن حتى تلقيح نحو 70% من أهلنا في الضفة الغربية وقطاع غزة والقدس.
On a related note, today marks International Doctors' Day, and boy, do they deserve the appreciation.
ביום הרופא הישראלי אני רוצה להצדיע לרופאים ולרופאות, לאחים ולאחיות, לכל נשות ואנשי הצוותים הרפואיים שעושים עבודה מדהימה, לכל חלקי העם והארץ והמדינה, לכל האזרחים, יהודים וערבים וחילונים וחרדים, אבל הרופאים הם כאלה. הרופאים הם כאלה. זה יהודים וערבים ורוקחים ואחיות, הכל, הכל זה משהו נפלא. כל העולם מסתכל עלינו ומוריד את הכובע. כל העולם מצדיע לכם.
And with that, you too can show your love today, so make sure to contact your doctor and medicine-related friends and tell them how much they mean to you, especially in this ongoing difficult time. Now, in other news, with just a few weeks to go ahead of the new Joe Biden administration in Washington, some 800 new settlement homes are slated to be approved for construction in Judea and Samaria.
Confirming earlier reports, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is today authorizing the construction of hundreds of housing units in Area C of the West Bank, or the Israeli-administered regions of Judea and Samaria. This including 200 units in Ralim and Nofei and Chemia, 500 units across Itamar, Beit El, Shavei Shomron, Oranit and Givat Zev, and 100 units in Tal Menashe, the hometown of terror victim Esther Horgan, who was killed last month. Her husband calling for increased settlement construction in the wake of her murder. And other settlement leaders also hailing the new decision.
הבנייה והאחריות לבנות את הארץ שלנו, בדיוק כמו האחריות על הביטחון ועל הכלכלה, היא של הממשלה שלנו. יש דיאלוגים חשובים עם מדינות רבות, כמובן ארצות הברית שהיא ידידה חשובה של ישראל, וישראל גם ידידה חשובה של ארצות הברית. זה צריך להשאיר לראש הממשלה ולהשאיר לנשיא ארצות הברית. אזרחי ישראל מצפים שיתנו להם לחיות ולבנות ולהתפתח בצורה טבעית וברורה, והאחריות היא על ממשלת ישראל לעשות את זה. זה לא עניין של מדינות אחרות.
But pushing back against the decision, lawmakers in the opposition, like Yesh Atid leader Yair Lapid, calling the move an irresponsible step, and tweeting that the Biden administration hasn't even taken office, yet the government is already headed for an unnecessary confrontation with the U.S. Likewise, Palestinian Authority officials calling the settlement illegal and an attempt to change the facts and narrative on the ground. Though that said, the facts on the ground have already been shifted. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo explaining in 2019 that the establishment of Israeli civilian settlements in the West Bank is not per se inconsistent with international law. Still, taking opposition one step further, Defense Minister and former Netanyahu partner Benny Gantz of the Blue and White Party is now instead approving permits for Palestinian construction in Area C, which is fully under Israeli control. And this in a dramatic reversal from previous rhetoric where Gantz himself said that Blue and White supports the legalization and construction of Israeli settlements in Israeli-owned land, with or without a permit.
And now that was Chana Rifkin reporting. And for more, visit our new and improved website at ILTV.tv. Just make sure to subscribe to our daily newsletter while you're there for updates. Now, speaking of the conflict in the Middle East, international leaders from France, Germany, Jordan, and Egypt convened in Cairo on Monday to discuss new ways to revive the peace talks between the Palestinians and the Israelis, especially ahead of the coming Biden administration, which they say should have a central role in future talks. Additionally, Arab states that have recently signed normalization agreements with Israel were given special reference in that meeting that the so-called Munich Group says will hopefully lead to the rebuilding of trust between both parties.
Wir wollen auch diejenigen in der Region einbinden, die nach der Normalisierung eine neue Rolle einnehmen können. Und auch deren Bedeutung kann in diesem Prozess größer werden. Und dabei sind wir uns einig, wir wollen weiter dazu beitragen, dass es dauerhaften Frieden und Stabilität in der Region geben kann.
That said, the outcome of the talks is so far nothing new. The group putting out a statement after the meeting emphasizing their commitment to a negotiated two-state solution, but based on the pre-1967 border lines. And they also urge Israel to maintain the legal status quo in the holy sites in Jerusalem and to cease all settlement activities, including in East Jerusalem, which the Palestinians say they want for a future state capital. Notably missing from the discussion, however, was any condemnation of Palestinian support for terrorism, as well as representatives from the Palestinian Authority or from Israel. And here now to discuss is Professor Ephraim Bar, president of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. Professor, thank you so much for being with us. Now, Egypt and Germany say that the goal of their meeting was to encourage Palestinians and Israelis to negotiate politically and to build trust. Where do Israel and the Palestinians currently sit in terms of their relationship?
They don't sit together. The Palestinians have refused to talk to the Trump administration about their efforts to bring peace to the Middle East. And they have rejected the Trump plan, despite the fact that the Trump plan mentioned a future Palestinian state. So it's up to the Palestinians to bring their house in order. We should also be aware that the Palestinians are ill-equipped at this time to be a serious partner for negotiations because they are very divided. Gaza is ruled by Hamas, while the West Bank is ruled by the Palestinian Authority. And there is also an ongoing succession struggle which paralyzes the Palestinian political system.
All right, well, now you just mentioned that, of course, the Palestinian Authority has completely rejected out of hand really any plan that came from the Trump administration. Do we see a Biden plan, whatever that may be, especially because it's expected that would be somewhat of a return to plans put forth by the Obama administration? Do we see that as potentially any more successful?
Actually, the meeting in Cairo was, its purpose was to bring about the pressure on the Biden administration to go back to previous plans. But I don't think this is going to be very successful because the Biden administration has definitely other priorities. It has to deal with the corona crisis, with the economic situation, and above all, in foreign affairs, it has the Iran issue on its plate. So it's doubtful that the Biden administration will be able to have the energy and the time to give priority to the Palestinian issue in the near future.
So what does, trust really between the Palestinians and the Israelis look like? Have we seen a good example of that in the last decade or two?
I remember the Oslo days, the happy Oslo days when people were saying that we have to foster trust between Rabin and Arafat. And I used to reply that Rabin doesn't even trust his own defense minister. So why should he trust Arafat? This whole notion of trust is a liberal notion that has nothing to do with the real life in international relations. It's all about interests. Trust has nothing to do with it because politicians by nature don't trust their interlocutors and they try to get the best deal possible.
All right. Ephraim, thank you so much for being with us, Professor Ephraim.
You're welcome.
All right, now a troubling issue is now returning to the fore as individuals and governments worldwide begin to fear an incursion on their rights to free speech, and this following the permanent removal of President Trump from social media platforms. Shares of Twitter, Facebook, and Google's Alphabet Inc. now dropping dramatically to the tune of billions of dollars in the wake of the banning of President Trump from social media. Twitter and Facebook claiming that the move was over violations of their community standards and guidelines. The tweet in question, President Trump writing that the 75 million great American patriots who voted for me, America first and make America great again, will have a giant voice long into the future. They will not be disrespected or treated unfairly in any way, shape, or form. And, to all of those who asked, I will not be going to the inauguration on January 20th. Then this, in addition to the banning of alternative competing social media platform Parler from the Google, Amazon, and Apple app stores. But far from the only person or company to be abruptly banned from service, and with little to no transparency, citizens worldwide are growing concerned over the true hold these companies command over free speech and the free marketplace itself. This as even libertarian former presidential candidate Ron Paul was blocked from his own social media account for calling out the chilling attack on free expression and exchange of ideas.
I mean, I think that's in the public commentary right now, trying to figure out how much clout should social media organizations have on the messaging. They've tried to do I think these companies try to do their best, but human beings are human beings. And, each one has their own political and social biases. So it's tough to ignore or tough to end around what the leaders of these organizations' bias are in what is the end product of the messaging. So it's tough to decide who's the police on that. Yes, they are private organizations, but because they do have so much clout in the world, it's a little bit of a seesaw to try to figure out, how to manage this. So I think there's, good, there's strong comments and complaints on both sides.
Chaim Siegel going on to add that the stock drop also reflects the expectations that legislation may soon follow, enforcing antitrust laws and maybe even revoking these companies' Section 230 liabilities immunity, which would have a devastating effect on their operations. And again, these concerns far extend beyond the borders of the United States, where these companies sit.
Das Grundrecht auf Meinungsfreiheit ist ein Grundrecht von elementarer Bedeutung. Und in dieses Grundrecht kann eingegriffen werden, aber entlang der Gesetze und innerhalb des Rahmens, den der Gesetzgeber definiert. nicht nach dem Beschluss der Unternehmensführung von Social-Media-Plattformen. Unter dem Aspekt sieht die Bundeskanzlerin es als problematisch an, dass jetzt die Konten des US-Präsidenten dauerhaft gesperrt wurden.
There is a general consensus developing in many places that it can't just be left to the tech platforms because they are also driven by their commercial interests. So it's got to be some authority which is able to move quickly. And ultimately, I suspect the matter will have to be finally arbitrated in through some sort of judicial process.
So is free speech and free market enterprise truly under the thumb of major media corporations like Twitter, Facebook, Apple, and Amazon? And if so, what can be done? Here to discuss is attorney Jonathan Klinger, legal counsel for the Israeli digital rights movement. Thank you so much for being with us. Now, are our rights being infringed?
Well, let's go back to how you began presenting this issue. Governments do not have a right for free speech, and barring government officials from speech, especially when they're lying and inciting violence, is not the privation of the right for speech. Unlike what's going on with other activists or political candidates, going against government officials is somewhat justified. Don't forget, Trump himself blocked a lot of people from following him on Twitter. Trump himself incited for violence. He said when the looting starts, the shooting starts. So blocking him was totally justified.
Well, with respect, those were not the tweets that got him banned. Just to be fair, those are not the tweets that got him banned. And again, I'm not talking about the government's right to free speech. I'm talking about an individual's, as all of us collectively. Which Trump, you're saying he's behaving as an individual.
Right, but don't look at Trump as the person whose rights should be protected. If you want to protect someone's right, go to the small town activist or for the Black Lives Matter protesters. Those guys are
but Jonathan, who are we to decide? Who are we to decide whose rights are protected and whose aren't? I mean, isn't that the basis of free speech?
Well, free speech is not your right to be violent against others. Trump specifically called for violence when he said, I will not be attending the inauguration. Their interpretation was, at least by Twitter, is that by saying so, he's calling out for his loyal followers, those patriots that he masks, to go there and to act violently. That's why they decided to ban him.
Again, I think that we can argue whether or not we can argue how people interpret
that
a tweet.
Was the official Twitter statement.
That was the official Twitter statement. The official Twitter statement. Yes, you're right. Was that he does not plan to go to the inauguration. How other individuals interpret that statement is up to them.
I will not go to.
How other people interpret I'm not going to the inauguration is completely up to them. And I'm not agreeing with that interpretation. However, what I'm asking you is whether or not these major companies have a right to infringe on individuals' free speech. At this point, I'm not even talking about Trump.
So what I think is that we're facing a big problem. The problem is that these platforms have a happy trigger finger going and blocking too many people. Now, these blockings are a lot of the times due to government requests, meaning not things that they decided to block by themselves, but because the U.S., the Israeli, the Russian, the Chinese government contacted them, asked for the removal of content, those guys removed the content. And that's a bigger problem than going and deciding later on what's going to be removed from Twitter. Now, as I see it, the problem with here is the conflict of interest. Legislators pay a lot of money to advertise on Facebook. They get donations from these big organizations later on. They also get their power from their followers. So they will not legislate against Facebook because they fear them. Now, I don't think that people will go and cancel Section 230 because, well, most politicians want Facebook on their side. Facebook can decide just to, reduce the exposure of one specific candidate candidate, and they'll kill him in the polls. No one will follow him later on. So I don't think that Facebook would wound down or be dismantled so quickly.
Well, I think that we can agree that a private entity with its own corporate interests deciding whether or not a certain political candidate gets any sort of runtime is a scary thought, especially because, as I think you can agree, the pendulum always swings. But unfortunately, that's all our time. Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Thank you.
In other news, free speech can sometimes be a tricky thing, but the following is a case of clearly unprotected speech. The Lod District Court in Israel on Monday ruling that the screening and distribution of the film Jenin Jenin is prohibited. Additionally, the court has ordered Israeli Arab film director and actor Mohammed Bakri to pay 175,000 shekels in compensation to IDF Lieutenant Colonel Nissim Meganji for defamation. Bakri being the creator of the film, which documents and critically covers IDF operations in the town of Jenin. Why? Well, because unlike a true documentary in search of truth and public enlightenment, Bakri stands accused of, quote, not checking even slightly the claims of the people he interviewed, choosing instead to present their narrative in the film as fact and reality without any evidence. Judge Khalid Silash adds that, quote, the plaintiff, a private person who was called by the state to military service, finds himself presented in the film as someone who steals the entire property of another person, a helpless old person, as part of an alternate reality completely the product of the defendant's imagination. Now, moving on, have you ever wondered what it's truly like to be a part of the Israeli Defense Forces? Well, the internet asked, and these Israeli Air Force pilots recently graduated from the 181st class of the Flight Academy provided their answers. Take a look.
Graduating from flight course 181 of the IAF.
And we're going to answer your most searched Google questions.
Being an Air Force pilot, how long does it take to become a fighter pilot in the Air Force?
You finish the course after 3 years, and then you do another year of advanced training.
Overall, about 4 years.
To get to the first squadron.
And after that, we move to the next plane, which could be an F-16 or F-15 or F-35. And then we have another few months on that, and then we become
operational.
All
right, next up.
Are there any female Air Force pilots?
Yeah, there have been a bunch, like 50 that have graduated.
In our course, there are 2 female pilots that are finishing. How hard is it to be a pilot in the Air Force? That's a tough question.
I think mostly at the beginning, it's the difficult part.
It's a lot of work, but I think that if you like it and if you enjoy what you do, then it doesn't really matter.
At one point, it becomes a way of life, and every day you wake up and you do pretty much the same thing, even though it's very difficult.
I'm enjoying it.
What types of pilots are in the Air Force? Oh, that's a good one. So there's fighter pilots, helicopter pilots, and cargo plane pilots.
Navigators.
And flight engineers.
Flight engineers and navigators of transport planes.
But there's also lots of types of pilots. There's some that are funny, some that are annoying, some that are nice. So there are a few types. We're not the same at all.
And now let's take a look at the weather forecast. Tonight, get excited because skies should be clear to partly cloudy with a warmish low of about 57 degrees Fahrenheit or 14 degrees Celsius. Then tomorrow you can expect a slight rise in temperatures for a high of around 74 or 23 degrees Celsius. And now, of course, before we go, let's take a look at what's going viral in Israel. Oh, the life of an IDF soldier. Can you imagine waking up to this? I too would be terrified. All right, but that is it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.17 shekels to the American dollar and 2.48 shekels to the Canadian dollar. For more news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Then don't forget to visit the all-new and improved ILTV website at iltv.tv and let us know what you think. Subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates while you're there. I'm Aaron Porras. Thank you so much for watching.